Well, it's good to be with you, Dave. We always have a good, stimulating discussion.
Yeah, I think this one's going to be one of those. We see a lot going on in the world right now, and you're out in Germany. I just want to give people a take of what's going on in a different country. I'm in the U.S., of course. And, we have everything happening in Ukraine. We have the oil prices shooting up. And I think Europe is getting hit pretty hard. Now, is Germany, are they having a tough time now? Are they looking to go to green energy and just dump oil? What's the atmosphere in Germany right now?
Well, this is one of the ironies. We have the Green Party in the cabinet. The Green chairman, Annalena Baerbock, whose claim to fame was that she was a gymnast, she's now the foreign minister. And she's basically a mouthpiece for NATO. But they're tripping over their feet now because on the one hand, they say, we have to support Ukraine, we have to stop Putin. On the other hand, Germany gets probably close to 50% of its electrical production from gas from Russia. Much of the oil that's consumed in gasoline and diesel here comes from Russia. And the prices have gone through the roof. I used to pay, and of course, the tax on gasoline in Germany and Europe as a whole is much higher than in the United States. Mm-hmm. But now, so it used to cost me about $65, the equivalent of $65 to fill up my tank. The other day, it cost $130.
Wow.
110 euros. And I can tell you, my neighbors who on the one hand are saying, oh, we have to support the war against Putin. On the other hand, they're riding bicycles, they're walking, their homes are cold because they can't afford to put on the heat. The utility prices went up 40% between November and December, and they're expecting it to go up another 25 to 30% in the rest of the winter. Now, the irony here is that the Greens know that there's a huge energy problem. And they've already shut down all but 3 nuclear plants, and those 3 nuclear plants are going to be shut down by December. They're talking about getting out of coal by 2026 or 2028. And all of a sudden, because of the costs of electricity from oil, gas, and other sources, they're going big for coal. And so you have the irony of the Greens, who started as a peace movement, are the cheerleaders for the war, and now they're cheerleaders for coal.
So they're just moving from oil to coal. I mean, that's not green or a Green New Deal. You're just moving from once. I mean, we've always had coal, we've always had oil. Or they're just switching back and forth now. That's all they're doing.
And the other point is there's no shortage of energy sources here. They can get all the oil and gas needed. All you have to do is open the Nord Stream 2. There's plenty of coal, and yet the prices are going through the roof. And the line is, well, Putin did that. And Putin did a press conference 2 days ago, and he said to the Europeans, I'm delivering as much oil as we're contracted to deliver, as much gas, at cheaper prices than you're getting from anywhere else. The reason you have high prices is your own damn policies. And he's absolutely right. The Green New Deal is already leading to shortages of electricity. There are warnings from the German military that if there's a blackout, which there very well could be, the transmission system is not prepared to handle it, and it may take as much as 30 days to get it back up and running. So the former president of Germany, Gauck, 2 days ago said, when he was asked about this, he said, well, Germans should be prepared to freeze for freedom. So, it's not so different from Biden saying, well, we're tough, we can handle it. Well, people can handle it. Some people are going to be out in the cold with no options.
And they can solve this very easily. And I noticed that each one of these, I call them criminal leaders, they're all on the same page. They're all using the same talking points. Oh, it's Putin, Putin. But they can solve these problems very, very easily. Here in the United States, I mean, look what Biden did to the lease agreements, to the Keystone Pipeline.
Right.
I mean, this was happening way before Ukraine, and they can solve it very, very easily, but they don't want to. That's the whole point of it.
The Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, when this thing first started moving with the first Russian troops going into Ukraine, Scholz was still saying, we're not going to shut down the pipeline. We're not going to break ties with Russia. We're not going to support the sanctions. And overnight, he shifted. And what I've been told is that this had a lot to do with the pressure that was put on the Social Democrats coming from the British and NATO in particular, but then also from Blinken and Avril Haines, who went over and showed Germany some what they called evidence that the Russians had plans to shut down Germany and use the oil and gas as a blackmail weapon. Well, that's something that had been talked about for many, many months by the West. But what Putin said when he was asked about that, he said, we've delivered constantly, persistently, on time with everything we've been contracted to do. Now, the last couple of days, Gerhard Schroeder, the former chancellor of Germany, who's a friend of Putin and who's on the board of Gazprom, has been in Moscow for discussions. And before we go into some of the details, I'll just tell you that what came out in the last 24 hours is an indication of just how bipolar Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is. He, after the talks yesterday between the Russians and the Ukrainians, he said, well, to tell you the truth, I never really thought we should go into NATO. And we probably could work out an agreement on Minsk II, that is to give some autonomy to the eastern region of Ukraine. Well, had he said that a month ago or 6 weeks ago, there never would have been any military operation in Ukraine. But then within 4 hours of saying that, after talking to, I think he talked to Biden and he talked to a couple of other people, maybe Boris Johnson, he came out and said, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. We're not going to let Russia do this to us. So he's back and forth and back and forth. Now, one of the unknown stories in the West, which is part of Putin's what Putin is insisting on, the denazification of Ukraine,
yes,
is that in 2019, when Zelensky ran for president, he said, we're going to close down these right-wing neo-Nazi units. And he said, and we're going to negotiate an agreement to fulfill the Minsk Accord. Now, Minsk II was signed by Ukraine, which guaranteed rights and freedoms to the people of eastern Ukraine, limited autonomy within a constitutional system, the rights to their culture and religion, and the right to have a vote to choose their own leaders. The Ukrainians, despite signing that, and that wasn't signed with Russia, it was signed with the eastern Ukrainian Donbas region, they've refused to do it. Now, Zelensky promised he would do it, and he went there after he was first elected, and he was confronted by one of these neo-Nazi leaders, a man named Yarosh, who's the head of the right sector and also the commander of the volunteer militia of Ukraine, the volunteer army. And Yarosh said to him, you can't do this. And he said, well, but that's what I was elected to do. And Yarosh said to him, no, you will lose your life. And he later said he will hang on some tree if he betrays Ukraine and the people who died in the revolution. So there have been reports of 3 assassination attempts against Zelensky in the last week. Supposedly one of them was by Chechen forces sent by Putin. But it turns out now that the Ukrainian security forces are saying that the Russians tipped them off to that one, which is interesting.
Yeah.
The other 2 were from the neo-Nazi units. So, Putin has proven to be absolutely right on this question of the neo-Nazis. And I'm sure you've seen the stories of the biological weapons labs all over Ukraine.
Yep.
And how do we know that? It wasn't the Russians who said it. It was Victoria Nuland who admitted to it.
She said it right out loud. And then they started to deny it afterwards.
Well, they not only denied it, but then they said these are defensive programs.
Right.
We have nothing to do with them. We expect the Russians are developing this narrative so they'll use chemical weapons against the Ukrainian people. And the final point that's just worth noting is that the seizure of the 4th unit of the National Guard, which is one of the units that's near the eastern region, they found papers that had marching orders for a mid-March assault into the Donbass by that unit, which has within it a whole grouping of this neo-Nazi militia, the right sector and C-14. So the obvious point is that Putin's move into Ukraine was preemptive. And I don't know if it's being reported in the United States, but we're finally seeing in the media reports that say that of the 14,000 people who died in the fighting in the Donbass, 70 to 80% are civilians of Russian origin who live in eastern Ukraine. So the idea that the Russian army came in and started mowing down Ukrainians is exposed by this, even the reports from the Red Cross and others. So every point Putin made, the concern for protecting the Russian ethnic population in eastern Ukraine, the danger with NATO, with weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, the denazification of Ukraine, all of it has been confirmed, but I don't think much of this has appeared at all in the Western press.
No, the Western press is just, we're all for Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and Putin's evil. He's just like Hitler. That's pretty much what they say. But they are coming out with stories now, because it's continually being brought up that there are biolabs there, that there are Nazis there. And in the beginning, they said, no, there's no Nazis. There's no biolabs. But as the evidence continually comes out, the news now is shifting, and they're trying to counter everything that's being said. And they're saying, well, the biolabs are there, but they're not that bad. Yes, there are neo-Nazis there, but they're not that bad. And they're just, their narrative is completely falling apart.
Well, now here's another one. I mean, this is really quite interesting. The Atlantic Council, which is one of the cheerleaders for the war, and I'll go into in a moment why they're so intent on destroying the Russian economy. But the Atlantic Council in 2018 had an article about Ukraine's Nazi danger. And it was basically a straightforward story about this group C-14 and some of the other groups that are involved. And it said, well, for Ukraine to talk about being a democracy, this is not a good look. Now, they never talk about the fact that Ukraine shut down the main opposition party and has shut down virtually all the opposition media. Had that happened in Russia, of course, that would be headline news. Mm-hmm. But here's the really interesting thing. This guy, Karas, who's the leader of C-14, did an interview, and it's available on YouTube, at least it was as of a few days ago. And he was asked, why is NATO providing arms to you if you're an extreme right-wing group? And he said, because we perform the tasks set by the West, because we have fun. We have fun killing, and we have fun fighting. Without us, the Maidan revolution would never have happened. Now, these are open admissions from people who march with the Wolfsengel, the old Nazi, one of the SA uniform symbols. They march behind banners with photos of Stepan Bandera on it. Bandera was the guy who set up the Ukrainian SS to coordinate mass killings with the Nazi SS done by Ukrainians when the Nazis took over the country. So the denial, I mean, what it really reminds me of is how the U.S. armed and trained the jihadists in Syria to destroy the Assad government. It's exactly the same thing. Only now, just as we said, those were the good moderate rebels, we're now saying these neo-Nazis are the good fighters for Ukrainian freedom.
Right. And actually, when you look at this, it seems like it's the same playbook. I mean, look what happened in Syria with, Assad is using chemical weapons on his own people. Here, we have the same exact story. Putin's going to be using chemical weapons. It seems like they're just rehashing the same things that they used in the past and trying to pass it off. Assad is using chemical weapons. Putin's going to be using chemical weapons. But we know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they use chemical weapons. And we know that most likely the neo-Nazis are going to be using chemical weapons on their own people if they should do this. And
they'll blame it on Russia.
Yeah.
And then when Russia says we didn't do it, the Russians will say it's a false flag. And they'll say, no, the Russians are claiming this is a false flag.
Right.
But you remember, Dave, it used to be if someone used the term false flag, they were a conspiracy theorist.
I remember that quite clearly. And I remember them actually giving me a warning on YouTube. Yeah, but now it's out in the open. It's amazing.
Well,
Well,
look, I think the most important thing that people need to know. This is not about Ukraine.
mhm.
It's not about the freedom or sovereignty of Ukraine. That was demonstrated in the February 2014 color revolution, financed by Soros, the State Department, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NGOs. They didn't care about elections in Ukraine because Ukraine had a democratically elected president named Yanukovych, and they ran him out and they shut down the opposition. Ukraine, and by the way, in what I'm going to say, I'm not happy about the people of Ukraine who are being killed, the civilians. It's not a whole lot of civilians compared to what the US and NATO did in Yugoslavia and Libya and in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I don't like war. I don't like to see people who are not part of a corrupt government killed. However, what we're seeing is that these people are the victims of their own corrupt government and NATO US using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. And what's the real issue here? The real issue is the moves over the last 2 years of Russia and China for a Eurasian integration policy, economic integration, which is connected to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, but also toward moving back toward a hard currency, away from a fiat money system, a trading system that's based on investment in physical economy and infrastructure and science and technology. Whereas in the West, we are completely locked into a fiat system, a funny money system, a speculative system, which is called a consumer economy, but which consumers have less and less capability to consume anything because the goods aren't there and they don't have the money. So the whole narrative is completely upside down. The fact that Russia and China reject the idea of the Great Reset. And why do they reject it? Because they'll never surrender their sovereignty to central banks and globalist institutions. They won't buy into the Green New Deal, even though they may say they are. And so you have an opposition to the only solution that the Davos crowd and others have come up with, which is to put the whole world under a banker's dictatorship. And not only is it Russia and China, but India is backing them. Pakistan is backing them. Ironically, India and Pakistan on the same side.
Yeah.
South Africa, the Saudis, Brazil. You have more than half the world's population in countries that refuse to condemn Russia at the UN General Assembly and who are having constant discussions with the Russians about how to move towards some kind of hard currency program based largely on expanded trade and joint infrastructure projects. This would completely collapse the funny money system of the City of London and Wall Street. And that's why you have little puppets like Blinken running around flexing his muscles about how tough he's going to be. The speeches given to the senile Biden, who goes out there and says, I am showing Putin how tough we are. Boris Johnson, who's in terrible trouble because he can't seem to stop having parties during the COVID lockdowns that he called. You know, Europe is a mess. And yet, because of the pressure, the financial pressure, the military pressure, and so on, and probably blackmail, every European government is lining up with NATO, even though many of them are very, I would say, distressed, and because the populations in many of these countries really don't want a war. They don't want to have the Russians marching through their country. But I haven't found a single person in Germany when they say, oh, Putin's a new Hitler, Putin's our enemy. I ask them, do you really think there are going to be Russian troops marching through Germany? And they say, of course not. I said, so why do you buy into this bull? And this is the power of the narrative, the power of the media, and the cowardice of the political leadership of virtually every single party in Europe and in the United States.
Zelensky right now, he's making the rounds going to Canada, to the U.S., and it seems that he's trying to get the other nations rallied up or whatever he's trying to do emotionally and trying to push their agenda. I think the deep state players in Ukraine, the neo-Nazis, I think they are losing the battle there. And I think Russia has full control of the situation in Ukraine.
Well, I think it's absolutely true. If you watch well, you probably can't watch it because it's not available. But Konashenkov, who's the spokesman for the defense ministry in Russia, he's a general, and he gives these 5-minute briefings. And what he's laid out is how they've completely degraded the Ukrainian Air Force, the Ukrainian military communication system. They've isolated the Ukrainian defense forces. They're not killing a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. They've just got them cut off. They've got them surrounded. They're not going into the cities because they don't want a bloodbath and they don't want to rally the citizens in Ukraine into a Warsaw Ghetto type reaction. So they're doing what they did to free the city of Aleppo in Syria, which is to isolate the military, destroy the weapons, destroy the system with minimal killing. Now compare that to the shock and awe policy the U.S. carried out in Iraq or against ISIS, where they leveled the city of Fallujah twice. The hypocrisy of the West, or you see people crying about the poor Ukrainian people. The former chairman of the Joint Defense Forces of Great Britain, whose name is General Sir, I think it's Richard Barons, was on British television, and he made a statement. He said, we should have a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And the host said, well, wouldn't that be dangerous? The public would never go for it. And he said, oh, the public will go for it when they see that the people who are being killed by the Russians look like us. In other words, classic British racism. Kill all the Arabs you want, kill all the Africans you want, all the Afghan population you want. But if you touch someone in Ukraine, a white person, that's unacceptable. And the British view is the same as the Nazis, that the Russians are Untermenschen, less than human. The Slavic peoples are not human. And so you have this hypocrisy. And the irony is that the people who run around in the United States talking about Black Lives Matter and racism and all of this are lining up behind the war.
I mean, there's a lot of sanctions on Putin, and he's basically moving and pivoting in a different direction economically, working with China, creating new supply routes and doing many different things. All of a sudden, he sanctioned Joe Biden. Let's talk about being prepared. As we can see, the world is chaotic. To survive what's coming, you need to be prepared and self-reliant. That's why I recommend getting yourself some cryptocurrency and some land, some gold, but especially a proper stockpile of emergency food. It's easier than you think. Go to preparewithx22.com right now, and you'll save $50 and get free shipping on a generous 4-week supply of emergency food from My Patriot Supply. They're the largest preparedness company in America. They've served millions of people who are prepared for what's coming. This food stays fresh for up to 25 years. It'll be there when you need it. So do yourself a favor and go to preparewithx22.com. You'll save $50 and get free shipping on a 4-week emergency food kit, which gives you breakfast, lunches, dinners, drinks, and snacks totaling over 2,000 calories a day. When things get ugly, you'll be glad you have this food kit. Don't get caught unprepared. Go to preparewithx22.com right now. That is preparewithx22.com, or click the link in the description. Jen Psaki, Hillary Clinton, and Victoria Nuland, and the rest. What's your take on that? Do you think that Putin has their assets now and he has, I guess, information on them?
Well, I think one of the big problems for the Western leadership is they keep underestimating Putin because they believe their own lies. That he's a madman, that he's a megalomaniac. They basically look in the mirror at themselves and attribute those characteristics to Putin. Putin is extremely shrewd. He doesn't move without having thought something through. Now, the question of what he's doing, on the one hand, it's simple that he's showing them the two can play this game. But if you're Joe Biden and you have something to hide that goes back to Hunter Biden's relationship with Burisma, with his relationship with some of the oligarchs in Ukraine, you might be very nervous right now. Assuming he's able to think these things through. I think the Russians have captured documents. The Russians had people in the various Ukrainian departments. Russian intelligence is fairly good. The idea that the Russian military underestimated the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainians are fighting back. Well, there are Ukrainians fighting back. The ones fighting back are the neo-Nazis.
Right.
Because they know if the Russians get them, they're going to be put on trial and executed for the crimes they committed in the Donbass, the burning people, 40 people burned alive in a trade union center in Odessa. The Russians know who did these things. They have the details. They know the Nazis. This oligarch Kolomoisky, who is a leading funder of Zelensky, and you hear this line all the time, well, Zelensky, how could he support Nazis? He's Jewish. Well, the guy who financed his campaign, Kolomoisky, who also financed his television show that made him a popular figure, Kolomoisky is the leading funder of the Azov Battalion, which is the leading neo-Nazi unit in Ukraine. And Kolomoisky is also very close to the Mossad networks in Israel. So you're dealing with one network of evil characters. I don't think Zelensky's evil. I think Zelensky is a puppet.
Yeah.
But the people behind him, the Ukrainian oligarchs, are essentially lined up fully with the Atlantic Council, with Chatham House, with the Council on Foreign Relations, and they're providing the talking points that you see from airheads like Blinken and Avril Haines. And the hardcore Nazis on the U.S. side are people like Victoria Nuland, whose husband, Robert Kagan, was one of the founders of the Project for a New American Century and one of the leading promoters of the Iraq War, who also became very close friends with Barack Obama. So I think what we're seeing is a potential to bring down this whole post-Cold War order, unipolar order system. And I think that's what, by Biden and his crowd and Blinken and Boris Johnson are so freaked out. What they're proposing, whether it's the Green New Deal or the Great Reset, is not popular. The way they handled the whole COVID situation has been pretty much criminal because they never even looked at the fact that their tearing down of the public health system played a large role in the number of people who died, whether it was coronavirus or whatever. The increase in death rates is because the whole healthcare system was torn apart by the privatization run by the big pharma and the for-profit hospitals. And who do they fund? They fund both leaders of both parties in the U.S. They fund Boris Johnson. They fund the Labor Party there. They fund the Social Democrats here in Germany. So we're looking at a blob, whether you want to call it the expanded military-industrial complex or whatever, a blob that is exposed. And this is something that Putin does know. And he also knows he's not going to get it exposed through the U.S. media. But they're being very, very, they're limiting what they're releasing.
Yeah.
They know a lot more. And I think that that's what we're going to see coming out in the days and weeks ahead. And the real question is how far can this oligarchy get Biden and the leaders in Europe to go toward committing suicide? The effect of the inflation, and this is the other point, Dave, I should have made earlier. One of the reasons the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the South Africans and others are looking for a new monetary system is they know that this one is gone. Yeah. This one is dead. The total volumes of debt could never, ever be repaid in a million years. And the only way they're going to hold it together is to continue quantitative easing of some sort, a military buildup, and looting the population in the West. And that's what you see with the hyperinflation. We're going to see, besides the energy prices, we're going to see food prices skyrocketing because natural gas is a main component of fertilizer. Grain coming from Russia and Ukraine is not going to be available this year. There will be food shortages on the shelves of American supermarkets. Or if food is there, it's going to be too pricey for the average person to afford. So the political shelf life of these oligarchs in the West is limited. And the only question is, do we have total chaos? Do we have nuclear war? Or can we pull together an alternative system? And that's why I keep telling my American friends, whether you like the Chinese or not, whether you like the Russians or not, they share the view that we have of the enemies of the United States. They are prepared to fight against the same people that went after the Trump presidency, the same people who are trying to say that any American who's a patriot is a racist white nationalist. The Russians and Chinese know the situation in the United States probably better than most Americans. And if the American people figured this out, and as you know, Dave, because I listen to you quite often, as you know, most Americans are totally flummoxed and angry and totally unhappy with the situation, but not sure what to do. And what we're doing, what the Schiller Institute is doing, is we're calling for convening a conference that would draft or establish a new security and financial architecture, which is based on two principles. One, no nation can have security unless all nations have security. The idea of a unipolar order is no longer acceptable. Mm-hmm. And secondly, security is based on economic policy, which is physical economy, production, credit not for speculators, but for producers, for small and medium enterprises, for the business people, for entrepreneurs and inventors and manufacturers. If we go back to that, which is the American system, we can survive this economic crisis. If we don't, if they keep pumping money to protect the face value of the assets that are being held by these swindlers, then we're going to have a hyperinflationary blowout like 1923 in Germany. If they don't do that, if they start raising interest rates the way some of these people are talking about, they're going to trigger a chain reaction of defaults, which will include corporate cartels, many businesses and corporations, but also there are 40-something countries in the world that are facing default, one of which, by the way, is Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to take people out of their homes the way they did in 2008, and they're going to foreclose credit cards, move again to collect student loans. And then the question is, who will fight it? So what we're calling for is for people to join us in a mobilization to demand that there be the creation of a new security and financial architecture. We have thousands of signatures, including a number of leaders from countries and parties around the world. We're starting to get some Americans to join, and we really need a push behind this. So it's not just countering the narrative and saying they're lying, we're telling the truth. It's what is the underlying economic basis of security? And it sure isn't quantitative easing and bailing out the swindlers.
Saudi Arabia, they made an announcement that they might consider taking the yuan for oil. Do you think the petrodollar at this point, you think it's over? And you think that the transition to a new economic system is in the works right now?
Well, I think it's being read its last rites. I think the ability to hold it together depends on the degree to which they can blackmail leaders and use military threats. But Putin has essentially exposed what you remember Macron about 2 years ago said NATO is brain dead. Yeah. And Donald Trump made similar statements.
Yep.
Here's NATO flexing its muscles. We're going to fight to the last Ukrainian. And they can't do anything because they know that if NATO forces go into Ukraine, the Russians won't hold back. And then the question is, would NATO use nuclear weapons? And if they did, number one, the Russians have probably as powerful or a more powerful nuclear arsenal now than we do. But who wants to use nuclear weapons? There may be some lunatics who think they can survive it, but not too many. So Putin has the upper hand in this situation. And it's not that he has the upper hand because he's crazy and wants to go to war. It's because he knows that the only alternative left for the West would be a nuclear option, and they're not going to do it. And so it's just a matter of time before they degrade enough of the Ukrainian military. And, I think I'm sure you've probably laughed at this at some point. We're sending all these weapons over there.
Right.
Didn't we learn anything about Afghanistan? Look what happened to the weapons we sent there. Either the Russians will destroy them or they'll confiscate them.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, Germany just announced a 100 billion euro increase in its defense budget. And the reason they can afford that is because they've been chiseling the investment in infrastructure and education and healthcare in Germany. So the austerity against the German people gave them a little bit of a nest egg. And what are they going to use it for? Buying weapons from the United States. They're talking about buying, I think, 35 F-35 fighter bombers that are, I think, $100 million each or something like that. So they can give all the money to the United States weapons procurement. Well, that's not exactly a sound economic program.
No, it seems like it's all connected. I mean, they're just passing money back around to each other, and it just never ends, and they just keep doing it.
Well, and when I say they're desperate,
mm-hmm.
I think that the last figure I saw is something like 46% of corporate bonds issued in the last 2 years are near junk bond or near junk bond status. That the trillions of dollars that were created since September 2019 with the repo markets and quantitative easing, $13 trillion the last quarter of 2019, and then another $14 trillion between then and now. To do what? To sustain the face value of worthless financial instruments. And they're sitting on top of derivatives contracts that are blowing out. And that means the credit default swaps are going to blow out because there are going to be margin calls, because people who buy credit default swaps, which are insurance against a derivative collapse, when the derivatives start collapsing, the price of the credit default swaps go up and there are margin calls, and it just exposes the bankruptcy of the banks. So you can pour liquidity like crazy into these banks, but they're not solvent. And it's the insolvency and the hollowing out of manufacturing and of agriculture that's going to destroy the economy. So they have no leg to stand on except war. And some of them may be suicidal maniacs. Some of them may just go into a bunker or jump on a rocket with Jeff Bezos and try and escape our solar system or something. But I think we can win this fight, and people shouldn't be pessimistic about it. The fact that Russia and China and other countries could be allies of the United States. The Chinese Wang Yi, the foreign minister, gave a speech 2 days ago, and he said, look, we would like to work with the United States on global infrastructure projects. Now, is that a possibility? Sure it is. If they invite us in and we actually start working on it and we don't get paid, then we'll know it's a fraud. But I don't think U.S. corporations would turn that down. And I know that German and French and Italian corporations are begging for being able to do contracts with Russian and Chinese firms.
Everything that we're seeing and everything that we're witnessing right now, it just seems like it's a very large type of transition that we're going through, because we know the central bank system, it's done for. I mean, I think it's been done for a very long time. And now it seems like everything that they're doing to Russia, where they're sanctioning, where they're shutting them down, removing them from the SWIFT system. I mean, Russia, they've been prepared for this for a very, very long time. They created an alternative SWIFT system. So did China. They knew that this was coming a long time ago.
Well, on January 25th, two anonymous White House spokesmen gave a report on a meeting at the White House that day in which they said, we're going to degrade their economy, we're going to destroy their economy, we're going to prevent them from getting technology and they said, we've been preparing this for months, if not years. Now, that's what's been going on. Whether Donald Trump was aware of it, there were people in his administration that started this. But it didn't start it, actually. It was the Obama administration that started it. But it's a continuous thread through the security and intelligence establishment in the United States. And what they're going for is the destruction of the Russian economy to finish the job that was started by the bankers of London and Wall Street and the Jeffrey Sachses and others with the shock therapy policy between 92 and 97. And Putin came in. Remember, Putin was brought in because Russia was undergoing an extreme demographic crisis, that is, a higher death rate than a birth rate. And at the same time, Russian oligarchs were cutting deals with people like Bill Browder, who's a longtime swindler from the West, with Bob Strauss, who was the ambassador to Moscow. They were buying up the best properties in Russia, buying the raw material firms, the industrial base, and everything else, and looting it to the bone. And Putin was brought in 1999 to reverse that. And it took about a decade to start turning that around. It was only 3 years ago that Russia's birth rate grew faster than its death rate. So it's been a long process. But one of the things they did was invest in science and technology, and that's why they have hypersonic missiles. That's why they have a military capability that probably surpasses what we've been able to do. And I think it's probably that may end up saving civilization, the fact that the Russians suffered and were victims of the Western policy. But in a sense, they took one on the chin for all the rest of us, because we're now facing what was being done in Russia during the 90s.
Do you think, Zelensky, do you think Ukraine is going to surrender, or do you think Putin is just going to take over Ukraine?
Well, I know that the Russians don't want to take over Ukraine because they're afraid that it would end up in a long-term civil war. In fact, what the British are already doing is setting up a strategy for a government in exile and arming Ukrainian guerrilla forces if the Russians took over the country to blow up everything. So I think the Russians are very well aware of that. Secondly, Ukraine is an economic basket case.
Yeah.
It's a country that has smart people, it has scientific capability, but what are they using their scientific capability for? Bioweapons labs. So it's on a suicidal course. And I think Putin is smart enough to know, just as he was in Syria, the Russians didn't want to take over Syria. The Chinese don't want to take over Sri Lanka. They would rather, their view is that if these countries prosper in a kind of co-prosperity sphere with Russia, with China, that's a win-win for them. Whereas the imperial forces out of London and Wall Street think that the more we can loot from these countries and take away from them, the better it is for us. And you recruit a few of the elites and get them to do the dirty work, like a Zelensky.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out the end game here, how he's going to end this. How is it going to end in Ukraine?
Well, it could be that he'll give Zelensky a way out. To say, you can stay in, we'll give you security guarantees, we'll even give you some money to help rebuild. Will you get money from NATO to rebuild? Of course not, because they used you.
Right.
I mean, Putin will, at least in private, make the point that his intent was never to take over Ukraine and destroy the country. And if you have a flourishing economy in Donetsk and Lugansk, which the Russians will probably do, if the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is extended into Eastern Europe, and if the Russian pipelines are allowed to function, this is something, don't underestimate. If Europeans are going to be freezing this winter, and maybe we'll make it through this winter because it's moving towards springtime. But if this war continues through the summer, next winter, people will freeze to death in Western Europe. So if Putin says to them, look, let's calm this down, let's meet, let's work this out, you can have all the oil and gas you need, and we want to have contracts with the technology and other areas, I think there's a win-win that is going to end up with maybe even giving Biden a chance to say, see, I worked out a deal. Although I can't imagine that the
I,
Russians think there could be a stable United States with Joe Biden in the White House for another 4 years.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. It's almost like Afghanistan, where he ended the war there, but had people killed, left the equipment. I don't think this is going to work out to his benefit in the end. I think actually Putin most likely is going to produce much more evidence once he works out a deal with Zelensky or whatever they work out. I think Biden, Nuland, Obama, and the rest. I think we're going to find out certain information about what really happened during 2014. 2015 and what they've been doing there this entire time. And I don't think this is going to work out well for the criminal syndicate.
Well, and I'll tell you who's going to play a role in this, who's very interesting in this, is Colonel Douglas McGregor. Because he knows very well, and he's part of a group of people in the military who know very well that what the U.S. is doing is suicidal. There's a whole group of senior level colonel and officers who are very well aware that Putin has the upper hand in this situation. And the people like General Milley and the higher level who are going along with this, Lloyd Austin, they're going to be out because their whole strategy, think about it. The U.S. strategy has been based on the view that if we had to fight a war, we have to be prepared to fight to win a war against Russia or against China. The idea that we might have to fight both, that's why you have people like the head of the Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, running around saying, we have to be prepared to use nuclear weapons because there's no other way we can win a fight with Russia and China.
Yeah. I think they're in trouble and they know it. And I don't think they have. I think Putin has all the leverage in this, and I think he's going to produce, like he produced the evidence to biolabs, not all of it, but a lot of it. I think he's going to be producing a lot more. And yes, the fake news, they'll try to spin it. They'll try to tell you that it's not real. Snopes will come out and tell you it's not real. But I think as more and more evidence is produced, it's going to become more and more real. It's almost like Russian collusion. If you remember going back from the beginning, they told us, oh no, it's real. It's real. Everything that we're telling you is real. And it turned out to be all fake. And we come to find out that Hillary Clinton paid for it all.
It's like slam dunk on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Yeah. Yep.
But here's the point I would make, Dave.
Okay.
And I know you've been very upfront in your discussions with your audience. We have to have more people with courage out there speaking every single day and not worry about being called a Putin puppet or a Putin apologist. Who wants to be a Biden apologist or a Mitch McConnell apologist, or a General Milley apologist or a Lloyd Austin apologist? We Americans have to be tougher and smarter.
Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. How can people get in touch with you and find your work?
Well, I have a daily update that's available to people who sign up for my blog page, and I'll send you a link so you can sign up for free if you ask for it. Just send me an email to my personal email address, which is harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com. And if you have some questions or some ideas to share, please feel free to do that. I have communication with a great many listeners of the